Have you ever felt like you're in an obstacle course?
In a subway.
Yeah, like you're just trying to make your connection.
Yeah.
Today, we're diving deep into that exact experience. We're taking a close look at Taipei Main Station.
The heart of it all.
This is super hub, really, of transportation in Taiwan. And you actually found some really interesting research on how people move through this incredibly busy spot.
I did, yeah. And for anyone who's ever felt that crush of people in a transit system.
Oh, tell me about it.
Right. Whether it's your daily commute or maybe you're just curious about how these massive spaces are actually designed.
The thought that goes into it.
Yeah, and sometimes the quirks that pop up, this deep dive is for you. We're going to try to untangle what makes transferring trains.
Which seems simple enough.
Right. Such a pain point for congestion sometimes.
So the source we're looking at today is a study from the International Journal of Transportation Development and Integration.
Catchy title.
Very catchy. It's from 2018 by a researcher named Mengkong Zhang, and it digs into, how to make improvements to passenger flow, specifically on the B2 level of Taipei Main Station.
So we're really getting granular here.
Very granular.
We're not talking about the whole system, just this one little slice.
One little slice, yeah. And our goal today is to, really break down the core findings of this research for you.
Deconstruct it.
Exactly. We want to look at the key patterns they observed, the movements, and then look at the improvements that were proposed.
So hopefully you'll walk away with a better sense of all those almost invisible forces that shape how we move through these urban transportation hubs.
The hidden dynamics.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's get right into it. Taipei Main Station. The scale of it is just hard to wrap your head around. We're talking about like 2 million riders.
Every day.
Every single day on the Taipei MRT system.
That's a lot of people.
And get this, something like 308,000 people are entering or leaving just Taipei Main Station every day.
That's just one station.
Just one station. And it's not just like one or two lines, right? It's this central point for tons of different rail networks.
A true hub.
True hub.
And this study really puts its focus on the B2 level, which is like the super important transfer point.
Okay.
You can get to the Bannon line, the Tamsiri-Jini line.
Wow.
Also exit 8 if you're trying to, get out into the city.
Right.
But there's also an underground market.
Oh.
A food court.
So people aren't just transferring trains.
No, they're shopping, they're eating, they're meeting friends.
So it's this constant flow of people all doing different things.
Right. Imagine this swirling mass of humanity all going in different directions.
So not just random, though, right? The study actually emphasizes how these movement patterns are interconnected and influenced by all sorts of things.
Yeah, it's not chaos. There's a method to the madness.
It's got individual choices like, how fast somebody walks, how far they need to go, even which side of the escalator they like.
Escalator etiquette, very important.
But then also, just being in a crowd, being surrounded by all these people.
There's this collective behavior that emerges.
Yeah, like are you going with the flow or against it?
Right, exactly. And what's really interesting is how the study actually breaks down how we move through these spaces into 3 different levels.
Okay, let's hear it.
First, you've got the strategic level, like you decide where you're going.
Your destination.
Exactly. Then there's the tactical level, those more immediate decisions like which way to turn, what path to take.
Okay.
And then the operational level, that's where the rubber meets the road. You're adjusting your speed, maybe dodging someone.
Okay, so like in the moment decisions.
Yeah, like almost subconscious adjustments.
Yeah.
And it's the interplay of all 3 of these levels that really shapes the overall flow.
And they identified one particular trouble spot, this T-shaped intersection in the B2 transitional hall.
Ah, yes, the infamous T-junction.
So those sharp 90-degree turns can really mess with the flow.
It's like everyone needs to pivot at the same time in this limited space.
Yeah, a bottleneck just waiting to happen.
And that was a big part of what the study wanted to understand. The relationship between the physical layout of the station, like where those escalators are, the ticket gates, the stairs.
The infrastructure.
Yeah, and the paths that people actually take.
Okay, so how did they actually go about observing this massive amount of people? It can't be as simple as just standing there and counting heads.
No, they got a little more creative than that. They used what's called non-participant observation.
Okay, explain that one.
Basically, they became flies on the wall. They used small cameras that they wore during peak hours, that weekday evening rush, 6 to 7 p.m.,
Okay.
to capture how people moved naturally.
So without influencing their behavior at all.
Yeah, just letting people be people.
Smart. So how many people did they track?
They observed a total of 320 passengers.
That's a pretty good sample size.
Yeah, they focused on 40 people starting at each of these different key points within B2. And their observations, they were centered around three main things: the number of people starting at each point,
Okay.
the precise path they took using this spatial coordinate system.
So very specific.
Yeah, and then any instances of what they call disruptive behavior.
Disruptive behavior, what does that even mean?
We'll get into specifics later.
Okay.
But basically, it's anything that interrupts a smooth flow of movement.
Okay, I can see how that would be a problem in a busy station.
Right, but they didn't just rely on observations. They also used Unity 3D software.
Okay, wait, isn't that for video games?
Yeah, you might know it from video games, but it's also really powerful for simulations of all kinds.
So they basically built a virtual Taipei Main Station.
Yeah, a digital twin, so to speak.
Very cool.
They use what are called NavMesh, and NavMesh agent functions within Unity 3D.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
It is, but basically these tools let them create this virtual environment
All right.
and then program these virtual people.
Like AI people.
Yeah, exactly, to move realistically, considering things like their speed, avoiding obstacles, all that.
Wow. So they can then test out different scenarios.
Exactly, and see how they impacted passenger flow.
Very cool. So what were some of the things they found? Like, where were the real slowdowns happening?
Well, first they just looked at the volume of people coming from different points. They used labels like US6 to identify different combinations of escalators and stairs.
Okay.
And they found that US6 consistently had the most people starting there, followed by US5 and US3.
So, like, the entry points.
Yeah, where people were coming in. And then they also looked at where people were going.
Okay.
They found about 39% were transferring to the Bannon line, 37% to the Tamsuinjini line,
Makes sense. Two major lines.
and about 24% were just coming in from outside.
Okay.
So then they looked at the congestion itself.
Where were the bottlenecks forming?
Well, they tracked very meticulously crowding at the different escalators and stairs.
Okay.
And what they found was certain escalators and stairs experienced this almost constant crowding, especially the ones connected to the ticket gates and the entrances from outside.
Okay, that makes sense. Everyone's funneling in.
Yeah, it's like rush hour all the time. For the Bannon line, there were certain upward escalators
Okay.
and their adjacent stairs that had the longest crowding periods. Same for the Tamsukinyu line.
Okay.
And then at these specific escalators, E1 and E2, it was just constant crowding.
So, real pinch points.
Yeah, the pressure points of the system.
What about the escalators themselves? Like, how people were using them? Did that affect congestion?
That's a really interesting point they brought up. They found that when more people stood on one side of the escalator, it actually made the crowding last longer.
Really?
Yeah, because it creates an imbalance. You're not using the full capacity of the escalator.
So basically spread out people.
Use both sides.
I-
Makes sense.
Okay, so we've talked about the high traffic areas, we've talked about the escalators, but the really interesting part, to me at least, is how those paths that people take intersect and how that causes problems. Yeah, the chaos of all those lines crossing.
Right, so they overlaid these maps of passenger paths, people going to the Bannon line, that was blue,
Okay.
Tamsukinyu line, red, and people going to the ticket gates, green.
The whole traffic light system down there.
Right, and what they found is that in certain areas, passengers headed for the Bannon and Tamsukinyu lines, they kind of converged on a specific section.
Okay, but going to different destinations.
Right, but sharing this corridor, so there's that friction.
Huh.
And then it got even more complex in these zones they labeled L through Q.
Okay.
It was like a spider web.
No.
These radial movement patterns, people coming and going in so many directions.
So a lot of potential for collision.
Exactly. And they pinpointed these specific chaotic zones near an exit and around certain coordinates.
Okay, so very specific problem areas.
Right. And of course, lots of people transferring between those two main lines at specific points.
So this constant negotiation of space happening. People just trying to weave their way through.
Yeah, and then you add in those disruptive behaviors.
Right, you mentioned those earlier. Can we get into those a little bit?
Yeah, so they documented 545 instances of these disruptive behaviors.
Wow.
The most common was changing paths. That happened 311 times.
Okay, so like a sudden change of direction.
Yeah, like someone suddenly cuts you off.
Right.
And then slowing down, that happened 140 times.
Okay.
And then there was dodging, stopping, even collisions.
Oh, no, not collision.
Unfortunately, yeah. And unsurprisingly, most of this happened at, you guessed it, turning, corners, and intersections.
Makes sense. That's where all the different streams of people converge.
Right. They identified a specific region that had the highest concentration of these behaviors.
So a real trouble spot.
Yeah, but outside of these conflict zones where paths were generally straight, there was much less disruptive behavior.
Okay, so design matters.
Design definitely matters. So now that they'd identified these problem areas, they moved on to testing out potential solutions in their Unity 3D simulation.
Okay, so they took their real-world observations and put them into the virtual world.
Exactly. And in the simulation, they divided the station into 11 different regions.
Okay.
They started with a baseline, what they called the control group, that matched the real-world conditions.
Okay.
And they found, as you might expect, that the slowest walking speeds were in those same corners and areas with lots of intersecting paths.
Okay, so the simulation confirmed their observation.
Right. So then they tested out 3 main solutions.
Okay, let's hear.
Solution A focused on actually modifying the designated walking paths.
Okay, so literally changing the paths.
Yeah, like rerouting traffic, but for pedestrians.
Okay,
They suggested detours for people transferring between lines.
to avoid those bottlenecks.
Exactly. Then Solution B took a different approach.
Okay,
They focused on adjusting the flow of passengers at those entry points.
so trying to spread people out more evenly.
Yeah, they wanted to see if a more balanced starting point would lead to less congestion overall.
Okay, interesting. And solution C.
Solution C was all about the escalators,
Okay.
changing their operating direction.
This is like reversing which way they're going.
Exactly. They figured if you can subtly guide people with the infrastructure, maybe you can reduce those conflict points.
Okay, so what do they find? Which solution worked best?
Well, drum roll, please. Solution C, changing those escalator directions, had the most significant impact.
Wow, that's kind of counterintuitive. I wouldn't think that would make such a big difference.
Right, but it seems that even those small infrastructure changes can have a huge impact.
Interesting.
Solution B, adjusting the initial passenger flow, came in second.
Okay.
And then Solution A, changing the paths directly, actually showed the least improvement.
Wow, that's surprising considering that was targeting the most disruptive behaviors.
Right, it seems like the infrastructure itself has a more fundamental influence on how people move.
So even if you suggest a different path, if the escalator is still creating a bottleneck, people are going to get stuck.
Exactly. The escalators, even if you're not consciously thinking about it, they guide you in a certain direction.
They really do. So changing their direction had a more systemic effect.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, they also looked at how long it took to get from different points to different destinations, right?
Yeah, they did. And they found, for example, that Solution C significantly reduced travel time from certain points to common destinations.
So people got to where they needed to go faster.
Yeah, but there were some trade-offs. For a few routes, travel time actually increased a bit with Solution C.
Okay, so it wasn't a perfect solution.
No solution is perfect, but it seemed to improve things overall.
Yeah, so optimizing for the overall flow, even
Yeah.
if it means a few individuals might have a slightly longer trip.
Right. And stepping back, what are the key takeaways here? What really causes subway congestion?
Right, what did they learn?
They highlighted several crucial factors. First, how often the trains come.
Okay, makes sense. More trains, more people.
The total number of passengers using the station, of course.
Right, the sheer volume.
The physical layout of the space.
Okay, so how the station is designed.
And critically, the location and operation of the escalators.
Those escalators, they seem to be a key factor.
They really are. They also noticed that people tend to cluster at entry points that are close to those transfer intersections.
So people want the most direct route.
Makes sense, right? You don't want to walk further than you have to.
But that can lead to overcrowding.
Yeah, unfortunately. They also saw that people prefer the middle cars of the trains.
Okay, why is that?
I'm not sure. Maybe it feels more central.
Yeah, maybe.
But that means those middle escalators get more crowded.
Right, because everyone's coming out of the same few cars.
And as we talked about before, that whole standing on one side of the escalator thing.
Yeah, that can really slow things down.
It really can. And all of these individual choices, they add up. They create these systemic effects.
So it's not just about telling people what to do.
No, it's about understanding how those individual choices interact with the environment.
And the design of the space itself.
Exactly. So what does all of this mean for the listener?
Right, what can we take away from this?
What I think is fascinating is how even these seemingly small changes, like reversing an escalator,
Which you wouldn't think would make that much of a difference.
right, can dramatically improve how well a busy space functions.
Yeah, it really highlights how complex these systems are.
Yeah, the hidden complexity in designing these public spaces. And it shows how powerful data can be in understanding and improving these everyday experiences.
So think about the spaces you use regularly. What are those little things that make your life easier or harder?
Like, have you ever noticed that one bottleneck in your subway station that always seems to form?
Yeah, actually, now that you mention it,
Maybe there's a small change that could make a huge difference.
like moving a trash can or something.
It could be that simple.
So keep an eye out. Observe the flow of people.
You might be surprised by what you notice.
Yeah, and the subtle ways that design can influence our movement.
And who knows, maybe you'll come up with the next big solution to urban congestion.
We hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on the ebb and flow of the crowds around you.
Happy commuting, everyone!
Until next time.